Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
I didn't know what FKG was. And then you ask your trainer and he says, "Oh, you're going to the Pershing missile, boys." And I'm like, oh my God.
Kris is a former conscript in the West German Bundeswehr during the Cold War. He shares his experiences from the moment he received his conscription notice at the age of 17, ultimately finding himself in the Luftwaffe, where he would serve with the Pershing nuclear missile system. Basic training was a rite of passage filled with challenges. Kris recounts the camaraderie formed with fellow recruits and the harsh realities of military life. But it was during this time that he learnt valuable lessons about discipline, teamwork and resilience. As the conversation unfolds, we explore the operational aspects of the Bundeswehr, including the use by West German troops of nuclear weapons. Reflecting on his service, Kris offers a candid assessment of his time in the military. While there were moments of frustration and a sense of wasted time, he ultimately recognises the profound impact that this experience has had on his life. The skills he learned and the friendships he forged would shape his future in ways he never anticipated. I'm delighted to welcome Kris to our Cold War conversation.
It was a compulsory service, ultimately, for every German citizen back then. The laws have changed a bit in past years. Now Germany is changing again. But when you turned 17 and a half, the registry of wherever you lived had to pass data to the Bundeswehr. This is a young guy, male, that is becoming 18. And here are the data. And then you received a little postcard from what is called the Kreiswehrersatzamt, which is basically the authority that was running the staffing, I would say, of conscripts in Germany. You had to reply stating the data is correct or not. If it was not correct, you had to provide correct data. And every male received this card. The proceedings then were evidently that after that you would be invited to, I guess it's called Musterung in Germany. I don't know what the correct word for English is. That your health check, your cognitive, what have you, your knowledge, capabilities, do you speak a language, whatever. And that happened subsequently after that. Every male had to go through this. Now, in Germany, you were allowed to evidently say, no, I don't want to do military service. In my case, it was still 15 months. It was the law. Every male had to serve 15 months. Or you could do social service, which was an option. That would have been 24 months. The other alternative that some people also did was you joined the fire brigade or other social services, Red Cross service, THW, Technisches Hilfswerk, which is, I would say, an engineering corps for catastrophes and that kind of thing. But then you had to sign up for 10 years, and then you were exempt from military service. So that's how every male ultimately had to deal with the topic in some way.
And how did you feel about conscription? Did you consider you were serving your country, or did you think, oh, this is a real pain, I'm going to have to do this?
It was a pain for everybody, and I think every male person. So I graduated from high school. I was planning to go to study in college. Everybody in my class wanted to get this over as fast as possible, which meant that we ended school in June, I will say, and most people tried to get the next slot in July to get right going, get the 15 months over with, and then start working or going to studies, whatever. In my case, I received a letter then, or again, a postcard after this health check and all these things, to report to an armored infantry division in Bavaria, in the Heer, the army. And to me, it was very clear, I did not want to do this. I was basically signed up for October's, which meant 3 months lost in a way, which I didn't mind too much. My parents were very, very good at caretaking. I had a summer job. I got some money, and I was planning to do some time off after high school. But I didn't want to join the army. And for sure not in in a Panzergrenadier unit, which means you're running behind a Marder armored personnel carrier, swallowing all sorts of mud and just cleaning the tank chains for 15 months. That was not very aspiring. And I replied back to the Kreiswehrersatzamt and I told them, look, I have this intention of studying aeronautical engineering. I really need to join the Air Force. And so they invited me for a conversation, and I had a talk with the planner. And again, I stated my case. And ultimately, he said, okay, I'll work something out for you, but I cannot promise you it's going to be October. Comes a couple of weeks later, I received a revised draft letter, I would say, to report in January to the Luftwaffe Ausbildungsregiment 3 in Roth, also in Bavaria, in Franconia. So I lost 3 months, and my parents were very forthcoming. They sponsored this time. I went on a vacation with a good buddy of mine who had the same problem. He really wanted to go to the Alpine team of the army in Garmisch-Partenkirchen. And so we toured Mexico for 3 months. Here I was in January. I had to report and go to my basic training in Luftwaffe Ausbildungsregiment 3.
When you say Air Force Missile Wing, this is the Pershing 2 missile.
Yes. So basic training first was, I had no idea I was going to end up with Pershing. This was just generic training on a specialty, which in my case turned out to be wire communications. That I would end up in Pershing in January of 87, I did not know when I joined basic training. Now, talking now about Pershing. So the Bundeswehr had very early access to atomic nuclear weapons. And the first missile really that the Bundeswehr had was a missile called the Matador. In Bavaria, they installed 2 Flugkörpergruppen, it was called back then. And Matador was this first missile that they had. This was a missile that was very close to, I think, if you think about now, way back time, the V1, which was this winged missile with an engine in the back. Think of that. And it was controlled. I think it had a range of about 800 kilometers, pretty close to Pershing. In 1963, the Bundeswehr installed Pershing. And this was the Pershing 1 missile, which also in line goes back to Redstone and ultimately also to developments of Werner von Braun and these type of guys that developed the very first missiles that were developed. The Pershing 1 was installed in Landsberg am Lech. So the Bundeswehr installed 2 missile wings. And these were assigned, contrary to the American colleagues, I will say, or comrades, not with the Army, because in the United States, the Pershing was fielded with the Army. In Germany, the Pershing was fielded with the Luftwaffe. There was a lot of debate whether it should be Army or Luftwaffe. In the end, the Luftwaffe won. And the primary reason for that was that only the Air Force could then basically do the reconnaissance work to see how effective the strike was. So we were Luftwaffe and not Army. And I didn't know that I was going to end up as a Luftwaffe guy with a Pershing missile, which was, in Germany, Pershing, the word alone, just causes a lot of unrest with people. Mainly due to 2, but not so much about Pershing 1, because I think the broader public did not even know that aside from where this missile was garrisoned, which was Landsberg am Lech in Bavaria and ultimately Geilenkirchen in North Rhine-Westphalia, that the Bundeswehr even had these missiles.
You mentioned earlier about a nuclear component.
Correct.
There. Now, West Germany did not have its own nuclear weapons.
And still doesn't.
But the Americans did have nuclear weapons, which the Luftwaffe could deliver via the Pershing missile. So how did that relationship work in terms of the handover, the government authority and all that sort of thing?
As Germany became part of NATO, ultimately, Adenauer, the first chancellor of Germany, very quickly drove towards this path. There was this thing called nukleare Teilhabe, which means nuclear participation. So the Bundeswehr during Cold War had access to nuclear warheads, ordnance, I would say. This started with Honest John, which was ultimately a gun, but also Lance. Lance was fielded with the Bundeswehr as well, with the army, not the Air Force, which could carry a nuclear warhead. Think further, there was the Nike missile, which also was capable of delivering nuclear ordnance. And the way it worked is that the ordnance was under the custody, that's why we call them custodials, of American troops and ordnance brigades, as they're called. But then the Bundeswehr would fire and deliver that ordnance with fielded weapons, which of course were mainly American only American design weapon system. And Pershing was one of them.
And Pershing was a mobile missile system. So if war came, you would have driven out to hidden locations around the country and awaited orders.
Correct. The Pershing missile really goes back to, you can track it back all the way to Cuba crisis and Mr. McNamara saying we have to be able to respond flexibly. And that meant being very tactical. And the way Pershing was designed was that it's really around survivability, meaning you're not stationed somewhere fixed, you're highly mobile. Pershing 1, the first version of Pershing, was on tracked launchers, meaning this was a derivative of the M113 personnel carrier. So you had tank tracks. And then in the early 70s, I believe it was in 1971, the Pershing 1A version was developed. And with that came a shift away from the tracked vehicles, which were slow, loud, not so flexible, I will say, towards a wheel-based launch erector type system, which allowed also faster speeds. And basically the goal of Pershing was, as levels of escalation grew, you would leave the garrison, go to pre-surveyed locations in the field, and be survivable just by being movable and tactical and swapping positions constantly. Now, during this whole time, the missile wings, not just the Bundeswehr ones, but also the American troops stationed in Germany with Pershing, operated a QRA status, which means quick reaction alert. So there was always one squadron on full alert in a fielded, nice housing station type things with pads, and we would cover targets in the Warsaw Pacts at all times. Missiles were counted down and programmed, so they were basically capable of launching within a couple of minutes. This setup I did not experience anymore, because as Gorbachev took office and INF discussions happened, that level of readiness was relieved. So I did not see that in my personal time during the Luftwaffe time. But that was the modus operandi from 1963 pretty much until I think it was November, December of 1986, where all Pershing squadrons always had one team, one squadron on alert 24/7.
I think it's interesting just seeing how Germany's armed forces were using it, and also the relationship with the Americans and the history right back to Cuba there. But let's go back to your basic training. Can you just give us an insight into some of your experiences there?
Sure. So basic training was 3 months. My parents drove me to the station of Stuttgart. I had received a card that entitled me to go on the train. And there were special trains at that time organized by the Bundeswehr to bring recruits to their various stations of service. In my case, I boarded a train that took us to Nuremberg. All young guys, not knowing what they were going to expect. Many of them still with some beers in their hands, I will say, before freedom ends. In Nuremberg, we swapped trains and then took a rural train to Roth, which is south of Nuremberg. And there we were picked up by buses of the Bundeswehr, all in olive, as it was usual at the time, with a special license plate, the Y, which is the military license plate for German Bundeswehr. Yeah, and then basically a new world starts. I mean, here I am, just gotten out of high school. I had my own room, and now you're assigned a room with 4 bunks. And there was this guy just that had arrived before me. He had used his personal car. He was older than I. Had already worked. So for him, it was really a disruption. This guy was making money. Now he had to serve his military time. And he suggested, hey, I took the upper bunk. I suggest you do the same because it's probably the better place to be than just being stuck down there. It was a 4-man room. We had a closet, a typical Bundeswehr equipment, not very nice. A table with 4 chairs in the room. Yeah, and then you wait, and then as it fills up, you're basically called out and you have to assemble in front of the building. And I guess the first thing we did was go to what is called the Standortverwaltung, which is a storage area, we'll call it, where you're basically given your first set of clothes, I would say. The first thing we got, it was winter, so we got the Bundeswehr Parka, which is very popular, with 2 flags, olive, what have you, and a training suit. It was not Adidas. It was something polyester, not very nice. And that was the clothes we wore for the first, I guess, 2 days with sports shoes. Yeah, and then they taught us how to assemble 3 men in a row next to each other, and you turn left, what have you. And then we did not march initially. It was all loose. And then we went to have dinner. Next morning, that's the first rude awakening, waking up at, 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning with a loud company Aufstehen type yell via the speakers in all the buildings. You're led to breakfast. It was really first, to me, because it was all sorts of classes first. There was a very big aula, I would say, where we were told about our rights, about what our duties are, military order and discipline and all these kind of things. And I guess for the first 2 weeks, it was pretty much that. It was very odd in a way.
So is that sort of like the Innere Führung or whatever it is?
Yeah, Innere Führung, I think you're spot on there, Ian. As a German citizen and soldier, you are considered to be a citizen, not just a soldier. So you have rights, right? And you're basically taught around this thing that also as a soldier, you are entitled to say, I'm not going to obey this order. Now, this could have very serious consequences, of course. But ultimately, there is this concept of Staatsbürger in Uniform, as we call it in Germany, which means you are a citizen with all your rights, but you're wearing uniform. So that was the first 2 weeks. And then little by little, it became, we got our good clothes now, and not just this training suit, which was a very long list. We had a CSAC, and you're given all your pieces of equipment. And then you learn how to build your closet with all the stuff, and it all has to be very neatly and fine and what have you. And of course, making your beds in the morning and in the evening. We had to learn how to sign off our room, because they would control it every evening, whether cleaned and aired the room and all these things. One of the 4 always, in my case, I was lucky. It was only 4. There were other rooms with up to 8 people. So we took turns in signing off a room in the evening. You learned that. Yeah, and little by little, we became soldiers, I would say. We started getting used to wearing olive. Initially, we were not allowed to leave home on Fridays in uniform. That came later. It was funny because at some point, I think everybody was eager to wear that beautiful Bundeswehr, Luftwaffe blue uniform. Not the olive one, the one that you wore every day, the one that really makes you look sharp. And many were asking, when are you going to allow us to do this, to leave in this beautiful blue uniform? And they always said, you're not going to do this before you learn how to greet another military rank personnel properly.
Did your father serve in the Bundeswehr?
In my family, there was no real military heritage, I would say. My father did not serve in the military. The only one that had to was my grandfather. He was drafted into the Volkssturm at the very end of the war. He was released from service. He was doing a job where the company said, no, we can't give him up. So he was lucky, I will say. But he ended up in the last half a year of the Second World War being drafted into the Volkssturm, as everybody was. And he ended up in captivity with the French.
I was just wondering, because I just imagine that your father might have given you some tips if he had served, but you just went in there blind.
None at all. I was the guinea pig of the family, I would say.
So at some point you have to swear an oath. What is that oath? What are the
there's a differentiation. Again, this comes to Germany in a way. We were conscripts, not people that I was not someone that signed up for military service. People that signed up swore an oath. We as recruits, conscripts, we swore, how should I say, a promise, a Gelöbnis, I think. That's the German word for it, which is not an oath. It's not as strong, I will say. It's still a very formal thing. So they taught us how to march a little bit before that. We all wore this beautiful blue uniform and it was snowing that day. So with a beautiful coat. By the way, there's a joke. The Luftwaffe has this beautiful uniform. It's blue. We make fun of the military guys because their pants are black and the jackets are gray. And there's a saying that there's a reason for that they can distinguish the jacket from the trousers. Whereas in the Luftwaffe, it's all blue. We wore what is called the große Dienstanzug. So you wear this nice uniform, but with boots and with your helmet, plus with a buckle around your coat, which makes it look very much, this is like very formal, I would say. So we marched up to this. Rot is a facility that was housing also the military helicopter tank killers, Bosters, BO-105s. And they had hangars. And this oath swearing, this Gelöbnis, happened in the hangars. Of course, family was invited and expected to join. It was snowing that day. We marched up there. And then basically the way it works is that there's some representatives from the troops that go to the troops' flag and represent every soldier that is present in swearing the oath or the Gelöbnis. Very formal. Right. My girlfriend was there. My mom was there. It was a family type day thing. Everybody was, a little bit proud in a way of all those that came to see their sons doing this.
At what point did they start thinking maybe they're ready to fire some weapons?
Rather quickly, actually. About 5 weeks into basic training, there were first rehearsals in terms of, okay, this is a P1, the pistol. This is how you take it apart. This is how it's operated. Next comes the G3, the rifle, the half-automatic that was standard kit. And it continued. We went on to the MG3, which was the machine gun. So at first, it's all very dry training. Basically, here's a weapon, you lie down, you have to take it apart. Even with closed eyes, so we would tie our eyes, and they would do little contests, I would say. How fast can you take it apart and put it together again? So that you became familiar with the weapon. You learn how to clean it. That was a task. They would check it, look into the barrel and those kind of things. The typical statement was there's still elephants in there, so clean it again, that type of thing. And then pretty soon it was out to go on the shooting range and start firing. And to many, I think this was the first time that they realized, okay, now this is serious. I'm shooting with live ammo. In my case, it was okay because I had already fired guns before from my previous times in other countries and with friends. So I was not so shocked as some of my comrades that for the first time in their life really fired a weapon with live ammo. The funny thing is, being in the Air Force had some privileges because we didn't march to the shooting range. It was freaking cold. This was February of '87. It was really cold in Germany at the time. We were loaded on trucks and they drove us out. I know from other friends of my school times that were in the army that they had to march it.
You mentioned that you had 4 guys in your room.
Yeah.
being conscripts, there must have been a real cross-section of West German society in there.
You have a talent for asking the right questions, I will say, Ian, because this was really the first time in my life that I was exposed to some people that probably I would never have met before. This one guy that I spoke about, he had already been working in an office, so he was okay. But the other two guys were people that probably I would have never met in my entire life. One of them was not very smart, I will say. He was also the one that caused a little bit of conflict here and there. So you had to learn how to deal with this, really. Which is, I always say, serving in the military at this time was also a life experience. And it was an element of coming of age, I will say, that probably I wouldn't have had if I hadn't been there.
I've heard this from people who served in the British military in so much that you might have had somebody weaker within the unit, but it was your job to help them improve because you all had to perform as a unit. So if they weren't keeping their cupboard, their closet in the right order, you'd show them how to do it, or you'd help them how to fold the clothes properly and things like that.
And that's where, and this was the other element of this, that's where camaraderie started building really quick. We were all in this together. We came from different backgrounds. But yes, people started realizing, hey, we got to help each other. And it really happened that way. There was people that maybe were a little bit better in terms of explaining technical things as we were trained on what we were becoming, which was communications guys. And on the other hand, other guys were the stronger guys, I will say, that helped the weaker ones that were just physically not as strong. And that was a great experience, I would say. This is the one thing that certainly sticks, this feeling of camaraderie among the conscripts.
Did you form any strong friendships in that group?
I did with one guy. He was not in my room. This guy, Didi. We became very good friends also after military. We did lots of trips together, exploring the world. And he was a character, or he is a character, I will say. We shared our little tent. At the end of basic training, we had this training event, I would say, where we went out into the forest for, 3 days or so, to apply all that we learned. So we built telephone lines, we operated the switchboard. The other teams from the Luftwaffe Ausbildung Regiment that were in other areas of communications, they operated the telefax, TTY type typewriters. They were the radio signal guys, and it all came together. And Didi and I shared our little tent, where it's not really a tent. Every soldier was given half a tent as a cloth that you buttoned up, and then with a couple of sticks you built a tent from this. And we spent 3 nights together, feet sticking out the one way, face the other one, in this very tiny space. And you must know that Didi was a little bit more of a corpulent guy, so he filled out the tent a little bit better than I did. But we had a ton of fun together, and making, of course, lots of fun about our trainers and the NCO. I think you call them NCOs, I think, in British. Yeah, it was lots of fun.
At the end of 11 weeks, you're sent to your first operational unit. Yeah. So tell me about that.
So the way this worked is that one day you were going to be told where to go, and everybody gets called into the staff room where the officers of the unit. And basically you're just given, you're going here. And they just tell you the abbreviations. I didn't know what FKG was. So they tell you 3rd FKG1. I'm like, okay, whatever. But you're curious, and then you ask your trainer, and he says, hey, what is this? I understand it's Landsberg am Lech. And he says, oh, you're going to the Pershing missile, boys. And I'm like, oh my God. Okay, whatever. And I was not the only one, so there were a couple ones, and you carpool. I had a car at that time available. We built little carpool communities. And I drove down the one day that we were released into our home units, as we call them, together into from Roth down to Landsberg am Lech towards FKG1, and I had no idea what to expect. It's all, you've never been there before, right? We took it slow. We drove together, stopped on various occasions to have coffee or a good meal. And finally, at some point, we had to report, right? And yeah, so you drive up to the gate. Here I am. You show your troop ID, and they tell you where to go. And yeah, I guess I did a mistake. I drove with my car right in front of the building, parking pretty much in front of the staff major's parking spot to unload our crap. Got all sorts of shit for that. Unloaded my stuff and moved the car quickly away. And here I was. I became part of the Pershing story of the Bundeswehr.
In those early days, there's obviously more experienced troops there, potentially professional troops there. How did they treat these new conscripts?
I guess the professional ones, they were professional. The other conscripts, it was all about your time still to be served. In my case, I was the rookie, so to speak, the greenhorn, the Füchse, as we call them in German. And of course, everybody, whenever they saw someone that had just arrived, they were all yelling, Fuchs, which means fox, basically. You're worth nothing, right? So you got that treatment very nicely, constantly in the first weeks. After time, it slowed down a bit. But initially, it was always, you were put in your space, I would say.
So was it just verbal?
It was verbal.
Treatment. So
I don't know about
hate.
I don't know about other platoons. In my case of the communications, it was purely verbal. Nothing bad. Nothing happened to me or anything like that. I was not mistreated. I was not obliged to do stupid things. It was just a verbal thing. And you learn how to deal with it. You ignore it ultimately.
So being the greenhorns, the newbies in the unit, I'm presuming that you're made to do some of the roles that are less popular, such as guard duty.
Well, guard duty was up to everybody. So the way this worked, Ian, is that I spoke about QRA before, right? The quick reaction alert. So the missile wings, both 1 and 2, had 4 operational squadrons. 1, 2, 3, 4. And the modus operandi up until 1986, November, December, I forget, was that one squadron was in the high alert QRA side, as we called it. And the other 3 were basically on a different level of alert. There were in total 3 levels of alert. One was QRA, so you were out in that QRA for a full week. Fully weaponed, you couldn't get out, you were there. Pretty much like Scott, I think it was, serving with Pershing 2.
Kris is talking about episode 122, which featured Scott, who was 23 years old and commanding a Pershing 2 nuclear missile. There'll be a link in the episode information if you'd like to listen to that.
The Americans went there for 3 months, which was quite different. We were there for a week before that. And then after that 1 week where you were basically 24/7 on alert, on a site, not able to leave, you were put on release, which meant you were home. You were at home for a full week, not doing anything. You were at home. No alarm duty whatsoever. And then you had basically 2 weeks of, it was called Bereitschaft, which was a 12-hour alert, which meant ultimately that within 4 hours you had to be in garrison. Which meant back then no one had a mobile phone. You had to leave phone numbers if you were going somewhere, that kind of thing. That changed. When I was there, the QRA alert week, I will say, was a week of guard duty. And of course, the younger ones were given the shitty days. So my first guard duty was on Easter Friday, where the garrison was empty. So depending on where you were in this level, you were given the weekend guards, the shitty guards, the holiday guards, that kind of thing. And as you progressed through time, you were given the better guards that had to be served. So one Staffel always had to do the guard duty. Normally it was the QRA weeks before. You were in QRA, but now it was the guard week. And everybody had to do guard duty regularly. And as I said, in the beginning, it was always the weekend guards. It was all the holiday guards, that kind of thing.
And you were having to guard, I think it's 3 sites that FKG-1
Correct.
operated in.
So Landsberg was at the time a very military-heavy city. There was the Flugkörpergeschwader 1, but also 2 army garrisons. FKG operated a total of 3 sites. There was the Saarburg Kaserne, which was the garrison itself, where we were all basically at home. And all our equipment, meaning vehicles, what have you, were basically stationed. This place has now become a residential area, by the way. So this was one. The other one was the Slager, which means this was where the missile stages were stored in bunkers. This was south of Landsberg in a little area called Dornstetten. This was a luxury guard because there were 2 watchtowers that had to be manned. And the third site that had to be guarded was the quick reaction alert site, which was the site Ochsenhof nearby Kempten, very much in the south of Germany. And this was the real winner guard, luxury guard par excellence, I will say, where one of the main watchtower had to be manned, and only very senior recruits were given that type of guard. The benefit of that one was actually that the soldiers that drove out there in a little VW bus, the catering was in a Gasthaus. So you went down to Görisried, which was the nearest village, and in that Gasthaus you were given your lunch and your dinner.
Very nice, very nice. And I think with Dornstetten, you actually had heating in the guard towers.
Yeah, there was a little electric heater on this guard tower. So you walked up the guard tower, and there were 2 lamps that allowed you at night to survey a little bit the field in front of this site. And in winter, you could operate a little heater, so you're not freezing your butts off while walking, not having to walk. You were up there. I shouldn't probably say this. I had a Walkman with me when I was on that guard tower, and I was listening to my favorite records and some radio while I was doing that. You shouldn't have been caught with that, but evidently there were ways to sneak that up there. You had a telephone to report if you saw anything. On one occasion, actually, while I was in Dornstetten on the watchtower, a car stopped on the Bundesstraße that was in front of that and started looking at us, and I said, this is kind of suspicious. So I called the guard, the officer or NCO having a duty guard. I told him, there's this car here, and he's looking at us. And he said, okay, just keep observing. And after a while, he drove off, so nothing worried. But we were up there and taking a good look at what was happening.
What were you guarding against? What were the threats that you were expecting during that period?
Well, like I said, we were told RAF wanting to steal weapons. That could have been one.
So you're talking Red Army faction, not the Royal Air Force.
Yes. No, not the Royal Air Force. Yes, thank you for reminding me of that. Red Army faction, Baader-Meinhof, the latest generation. As a matter of fact, just before I joined the Bundeswehr, I think about a half a year before, one of the Bundeswehr Kasernes was attacked by them. They stole weapons. So this was one. I guess it was also more the topic around Pershing being such a controversial word and weapon system in German society, with activism, opponents of rearmament, with the double track decision of NATO, those kind of things. But again, for Dornstetten and Curay, it was not a problem. This was more concern around Saarburg Kaserne, really downtown in Landsberg, because the gate was very much in a street that was a bit condensed. We had 2 gates, one on the side and the main gate. But the main gate you could very easily have blocked, let's say, with an action. And luckily, I never experienced one. My first guard was actually a gate guard, which after I experienced that one, I said I don't want to do again. I prefer to meander around the Kaserne with a buddy. The gate guard I did not enjoy, because particularly when it was a quiet holiday, nothing happened. You were just sitting there and standing there. And at night, you would walk up to the gate, because again, at night we closed the gate. And as you walk up, you don't know who's there and what the intentions are. So I did not feel too comfortable about that one. I prefer to meander around the Kaserne when I had guard duty.
What were your rules of engagement on those guard duties?
Pretty much, it's very simple. When you are assigned guard duty, there's a process called Vergatterung, which means you're changing your disciplinary lines. You become part of the guard team. And your purpose really is to stop anybody from going over the fence. And that's as simple as that, meaning you first, of course, you threat, meaning stop, don't move. As a Wache, you are entitled to control people relative to identify yourself. You can hold people, stop, don't move, and then you have to call more senior people, evidently. But yeah, you're walking around along the fence line at 2 in the morning, 2:30 in the morning, and you hear noises. You can be a little bit concerned, let's say, here and there. Yeah, ultimately, it's not like you're supposed to kill someone. No, that's not the case. You're supposed to stop something from happening. And that starts with levels of escalation. First, address the person. And if need be, make use of the weapon, not to kill, but to stop someone from doing something.
And when you're not on guard duty, what were your other duties?
Well, in communications, we were basically taking a lot of care of our equipment. Being so tactical, we were out in the field pretty much every quarter, I would say 3 to 4 times on different trainings. These were levels of wing training where the whole wing basically dispersed into the woods, or just at our Staffel, our squadron level. We even had communications trainings. So every quarter we were out in the woods, in the mud, regularly, which means training, setting up, but then bringing the equipment back in. You have to take care of it, clean it. In our case, look after the wires, splice them back up again. Our telephones, our field telephones, they had batteries, make sure they're working. They were not treated very nicely by people. So you had to select the ones that had to go back to service. And in my case, we had our equipment in the basement, and that allowed us to catch up on sleep occasionally where needed, because we were out in the basement taking care of these things, but okay, every once in a while doing siesta. But yeah, it was a mix between taking care of our stuff, looking after our equipment, and training. There was a lot of training going out into the woods.
And what was it like working with the Americans?
It was, in my case, speaking English, I actually talked a lot to these guys. Every time we went out, there was a process. So we would pack up our gear, go to assembly areas where we would get the squadron together and align who's following the convoy. We would go in convoys in different paths. And that's where you would basically get a lot of contact with these guys. Being communications, one of my tasks was always to give them a phone and make sure they had a means of communication wired. And that just brought contact with these guys. I remember that in one of the trainings where we were out on the QRA, I really appreciated our American friends doing a barbecue and putting hamburgers on the grill for their German friends. So that was nice in a way. I envied them a little bit because I thought that their equipment was so much better than ours relative to the gear that you wear. In winter, they had overboots, plastic boots, so your boots wouldn't get soaked up in water and that kind of stuff. They had the nice Gore-Tex jackets. The military gear of the German Bundeswehr back then in the 80s was not the best. Once wet, you wouldn't get it dry again. And these guys had much more modern stuff. I think also their rifle, the M16, was a lot lighter than our G3. But you start talking to these guys. It was a good exchange. I enjoyed it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm grateful for you sending me the Pershing 2 firing battery manual.
Yeah, I thought that would be interesting because, again, there's evidently procedures and a lot of... I think that one doesn't tell the 1A procedures in full because it's so much more developed. The Pershing 2 was so much more modern compared to 1A. Yeah, total differences.
But it was interesting because it gave you like the order of the convoys, the local area defense setup, when you were out in the field and things like that. It was interesting and very 1980s. The graphics on it, you can tell what decade that's from.
I remember talking about lines and that kind of thing. So maybe I should talk a little bit about how a squadron was set up. I don't think we have talked about that. So you had evidently the staff taking care of meals, that you get your pay, that kind of thing, your vacation slips and that kind of thing, which were very important. There was communications. That was me, a very small team. Ours was actually led by a Hauptfeldwebel, so not even an officer, an NCO, you call it in Britain. Then you had the missile platoon, which was operating the missiles, very technical guys. And there was conscripts in that one as well. This was amazing. This is where I think the Bundeswehr is a bit special in this space, because I think 50% of every missile wing was composed of conscripts like me that was serving there 15 months. And you had guys 15 months conscripts being right next to the missile, which was a no-go area. I was always told, keep a distance of 1 meter. That's your rule. Don't go to it. Don't touch it. And then you had the biggest platoon, I will say, or team, which was, I guess the best way to describe it is infantry. These guys are the ones that are going to protect you. And we're talking about more than 100 guys that were in this team. Whereas communications, we were maybe 20. A lot of the soldiers in each squadron were really troops that were protecting us. And their main equipment was barbed wire. I mean, they would literally set up rings around the missiles with barbed wire that marked, and you were not allowed to go close anywhere near. Or in my case, I was always very close to the PCC, so the Platoon Control Center, where ultimately the commander was with the shooting box. Also there, a very restricted area. Yeah, that's how we were set up. And again, we would move into spaces in the forest and then simulate our shootings and then go elsewhere. That was survivability of Pershing. Always be on the move.
It must have been quite difficult, because every 15 months you're going to get another load of people through.
Absolutely.
Who you've then got to train and start it all again. It's a very inefficient way.
It was, but somehow I don't know how it worked. Ultimately, somehow it worked, I guess, in the Bundeswehr. We were different to the US guys, like Scott, right? This guy that you interviewed. These were professionals. They had signed up for a period of time, 4 years, 6 years, 10 years, whatever. You had a lot of constant movement in here. Somehow it worked. I think this is an amazing part of all of this, that just normal recruits doing their 15 months were assigned to this type of an organization or team. Or
in your notes, you talk about the TAC evals, the tactical evaluation exercises. Can you just take me through how those worked and the role of the comms teams and what you got up to?
Yeah. So both of the missile wings of Bundeswehr were also basically on the direct assignment of NATO, SHAPE, and SACEUR. 4th Allied Tactical Air Force, in my case, with FKG-1. And basically, we had to provide proof on a yearly basis to NATO that we were up to speed and sharp, I would say. This is what was called the tactical evaluation. In my case, again, times have changed. We were no longer on this constant alert, QRA status, what have you. But still, we had to provide that we were following procedures, that we were sharp, that we were a unit that was up to the level, I will say. TACEVAL, in my case, in 87, started with pre-alarm. So I remember that at one time, I think it was in October, in the middle of the night, the alarm went off and everybody get going, pack up all your stuff as if you're leaving the barracks. We had to take everything with us, which meant really was like we're going to war, I will say. My closet was empty after this. And it took that level of preparation, load your gear into the vehicles, and up until the point where we went to the assembly area. And that's where the drill ended for that moment. So this was around the end of the day of that day, and to be continued. And there were these guys with little marks on their arm here, observer, what have you, taking all sorts of notes. How this was all happening, what was happening, how we were dealing with things. They were just observing and taking notes. And this all went into the evaluation of how the alarming went and how we followed procedures and all that kind of thing. And then it ended. There was pause, and now the drill is over, so we're going back. You unpack everything back again, and everything's fine. So that was TACAVAL, first part. And then we were told that, again, in December of 87, and this is the ironic part, we were to show up to barracks on Sunday, the 13th of December of 87, for the continuation of TACAVAL, which was now basically from where we had left in the assembly area to go on now into the field and, play the script, I would say. Ironically, on December 8th of 87, the INF treaty was signed by Mr. Reagan and Mr. Gorbachev. And the fact that we rolled out, the whole FKG-1 rolled out of Landsberg on that Sunday caused all sorts of stirrups with the Green parties, and how can this be? They're playing war again after the INF treaty was signed, and that kind of thing. Regardless, it was not internet times. We were not as connected. We didn't realize this. It was snowing. It was a cold winter. And here we are again, rolling out with our missiles, with the whole gear into the forests. As the other colleague from Pershing 2 said, we always headed west, not east. Going into pre-surveyed areas in German forests around Landsberg. In this case, we patched a very long line from, there were these telephone posts with Deutsche Bundespost boxes, which we were allowed to open and hook up our cables so that we would have telephony network. And we laid a cable that was at least, 2 kilometers into our site for telephony and telefax. Yeah, and then basically went through levels of escalation, simulated launches, pack up again, go to another site. And that was TACAVAL. And then on the end of the week, we went back to barracks. I commend my major because he was always the one that said, no one leaves the barracks until everybody's back home. And we, the wire guys, were the ones that had to collect all the wires that we had laid. We were the last ones in. And that's when we had weekend then after that. And again, always with observers, people from NATO taking notes. Evidently, I never saw any results. We were told it was all good. We had passed. We were sharp. We were proving the expected. And that was TACAVAL.
And did you see any Warsaw Pact observers? Because at that point, I think there was agreement for some Warsaw Pact troops to observe, and
I did not.
NATO troops.
I did not. At that time, I did not. There may have been. I think the treaty had just been signed. It was not yet ratified. That may explain that. We know that the Russians and the British and the Americans had these observers that were patrolling and going into the different sectors, as it was called. I never saw one of them, to be honest. We had one case where we were in a field. This was about a half a year before TACAVAL, where all of a sudden a young guy and another guy on a motorcycle entered our side driving through the forests. And this caused a lot of tension. But in the end, I think it was just two boys having fun. But yes, it did cause a lot of tension when someone with a motocross bicycle was driving around the forest and into our side. That created a lot of tension. But I never saw anyone from the Soviet military mission that was observing or that kind of thing, no.
And I think on a couple of these exercises, you got into trouble making calls that you shouldn't have been making.
Yeah, so as I said, we were patching lines on telephony. with the Deutsche Bundespost running telephony network at the time. It was all very formal back then in Germany. No Vodafone, nothing like that. And we were given numbers to try the lines, which were basically, we were calling into the wing operating center in Landsberg am Lech. And of course we did that, but I also happened to call my mother just to say, hello, I'm doing fine. Everything's great. Here I am again. I'm calling you from the middle of freaking nowhere in the German Bavarian forest. And for some reason, my mom had this crazy idea of, I have a phone number here. I'm going to see how my son is doing 3 days later. And so she dialed the number and asked if she could talk to me. And then basically all of a sudden I was on an off guard. I was just relaxing and someone comes, hey, Gamaji, come here and go and report to the major. And then I was told, hey, your mother just called here. How can this be? And I said, oh, yeah, I called my mom and she probably did a mistake and she was thinking she doesn't realize what we're doing here and she has no clue. Anyway, so I was told, do not ever do this again. It was not a problem for me in any way or form. I was not punished or whatever. I was just told, don't do this again. This is a little bit secretive what we do here. Don't share these numbers with your family. They shouldn't be calling us in the middle of a Pershing alarm here in operation. So yeah, that was one of them. But nevertheless, I still use one after Tekeval when we were packing up our lines. I did call my girlfriend on one occasion from the forest as well, just to say hello.
Yeah, but she happened to be in Mexico, not Germany.
Well, yeah, okay, that's my background. So she was at the time in Mexico, and I dialed the country code 0052 for Mexico. My NCO, my sergeant, he was cool with it. He said, yeah, just go ahead, do it. Don't do it too long, whatever. Don't worry about it. Go ahead, say hello to your girlfriend. But don't make it an excessive long call.
Brilliant, brilliant. You talk quite fondly in your notes about some of the officers that you were working with, and it sounds like you had good relationships there in terms of it was quite relaxed, but they obviously expected you to perform your duty accurately.
Correct. We were expected to do our best and just not drag around, I will say. And I said to myself, let's make the best out of this. The Hauptfeldwebel of the communication teams, he was a very caretaking guy, I would say, in a way, right? He looked after his team, let's put it this way. And that's why I really appreciated him for that. Well, this was not just here the recruits and they have to, you bash them and what have you. No, this was you asked him, can I have a vacation on this period because this is happening? And he would say, he would give you a look. Yeah, maybe I'll think about it. But then in the end, he said, yeah, go ahead. And he took care of his people in the comms team. We had a good spirit, if I may call it this way. There was good morale. And you have to build that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You've got to have respect going both ways to make that work. What was your nuclear, biological, chemical kit like?
It was a bit of a joke, I think. It was a mask. And then we had this poncho, which was how to describe it? It was not plastic, this typical tent waterproof material that keeps water from coming in, but it keeps sweat going out the other way. That's the best way to describe it. And again, you wore it over your head with a cap, and you wore it over your body, and there was no arms or sleeves or anything like that. You just had buttons in the end. That was your kit, the mask plus this thing. The mask, I can understand, okay, you prevent from breathing stuff. How this would have served nuclear, I don't know. Radiation goes through that, right? It's not a lead suit or anything like that. It was a bit of a joke. And you carried this in a bag that you had to put around your shoulder and buckle to your waist. I hated the mask, by the way. It was not a comfortable thing. And plus it was the German one with the filter on the front where you look like a bit of a maniac. Again, coming back to our American friends, their kit was better. Their filter was on the side. The mask was bigger eyepieces, that kind of thing. The mask reminded me of a little bit the Luftschutzmaske that my grandmother and my grandfather showed me from times of the Second World War.
Because I think at one point you were caught without the bag.
Correct. This was one of the many trainings of the Staffel, and I was hanging around our communications Unimog where we camped out and slept in and what have you. And I was walking around this Unimog, and our staff leader, Major Oland, caught me walking around without my gear. And I was given a personal ABC alarm. So basically he said, for you, ABC alarm, time's ticking. And of course, I didn't have my gear, so I had to run around the truck to the back, get my gear, put my poncho on, the mask and the whole thing. And by the time I had just boarded the flatbed of the Unimog, he said, time's up, you're dead. And I was given the speech, don't you ever walk around here without your gear, regardless of what's happening. You always have to wear this. And I think it was okay. It was fair. Again, this could have been Takeval. This could have been an Takeval. This would have been flagged out as soldier XYZ didn't have his gear on and that kind of thing. So they looked after these things. It was important to have your kit with you.
So at the end of March 1988, you leave the Bundeswehr, but I presume you're still on the reserve. So how long would you be on the reserve?
So normally it would have been up until I think the age of 40 or 46 even. In my case, I was not put into reserve. It was becoming obvious INF had been signed in December of 87. Things were cooling down further and further. And I was not put on reserve. I was allowed to take my underwear with me. Every other piece of kit I had to give back. Contrary to my buddy Didi that I had been in basic training with, he was put into reserve. So you get a sleeve and basically you become part of the reserve, which means you have duties. You have to tell the country when you leave the country for longer periods of time, that kind of thing. Nothing for me. I think it was becoming obvious that the future of FKGs was coming to an end. Originally, the plan had been that these FKGs, the Flugkörpergeschwader, would have received a version of the Pershing 2 missile, the Pershing 1B it would have been called, which would have been a single-stage version of the Pershing 2. The missiles were becoming old, right? The plan was that renewal was due by 92 anyway. Again, I did not join the reserve. I was released. I went home with my underwear.
Brilliant. Do you still have the underwear?
No, I don't. And I wouldn't fit into it anymore.
Kris, can you remember hearing about the opening of the Berlin Wall?
I do. So after military service, again, April 1st, I was a free man, so to speak. I went on to do my college studies and all that kind of thing. 1989, I was in Munich. I was doing an internship with BMW at the time. And on November 9th, I was serving my internship in the finance department on the 19th floor of the beautiful building of BMW downtown Munich there on Petuelring. I never got higher than that. I went back home that evening a little bit later. We had still lots of work to do. And I had been assigned a parking lot on the other side of what is the street there that divides where now BMW World is and the headquarters at that time. And I walked up to my car and I turned on the car and the radio comes on and I start hearing these messages that something's happening in Berlin. And I sat there on that parking lot for about half an hour listening to the radio and I couldn't believe what was happening. I think many Germans from that time will be able to tell you where they were at on that day. And here I am as an ex-Pershing guy whose missiles were oriented towards not so much the GDR at the time. I was worth more into Czechoslovakia, I believe. But history was being written. And the ironic thing is I was in the GDR in 88 of October. So just about a little bit of a year before. And I still experienced that state was like, what it was like to enter the state as a German citizen, having to pass the border and showing your documents, having to pay your 24 Deutschmarks, then you get 24 East Deutschmarks back, which was worth nothing ultimately. This was with the studies. We went to there. I saw the Berlin Wall. I experienced going through Friedrichstraße, the border there. I had been in Moscow early that year in '88 before, still living a little bit that state and that Warsaw Pact type thing, the enemy as it was called for me at the time when I was serving. It was quite an event, and I couldn't believe it. And as a matter of fact, I was living together with a buddy of mine from studies, and we went to Berlin the weekend after to experience this.
Wow. And what was that like?
It was crazy. It was unbelievable. It was unbelievable. I've never seen so much, how could I say, it was a sense of peace that you would never have experienced before. People were falling into each other's arms, and something really changed. It was history in the making.
Incredible. When you look back at your service in the Bundeswehr, how do you feel about that?
I enjoy every moment of it at the time, to be very honest. It was, many people at the time looked at it as wasted time. That's how I felt initially. Here, you're going to have to go through this. The most important thing was your calendar. You're counting down days, how far. There's a whole process around that with the little meter band where as of 150 day, you start ripping every day off from this little tape that's you're counting the days backwards. I still have the last 9 days becomes a whole theatrical thing with these little signs, these yellow signs that you attach to trucks from 9 to 1, and little cords that you wear on the uniform showing to others you're about to get out of here. In retrospect, to be honest, I think it was worth being there. It was a lesson in many ways that has served me also later in professional life, having to deal with people that probably in your life never before you wouldn't have wanted to meet, nor have to deal with, avoiding conflicts, those type of things, being able to, I will say, adapt. I think that's the best word to describe it. It was a lesson in how to adapt to an environment, to rules, to things that maybe you didn't like. I still fold my shirts when I go on a trip the Bundeswehr way. I taught my dad, who never was in the military, how to fold the shirts this way, and he loved it. So there's always good and bad. Sure, there were times where I hated it, and I saw it as a waste of time. But in retrospect, I look at it back as it wasn't that bad.
Yeah, and if you hadn't have done it, you wouldn't have ended up on Cold War Conversations.
Absolutely.
So there's that added bonus as well.
You bet.
Don't miss the episode extras such as videos, photos and other content. Just look for the link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. If you'd like to help, go to coldwarconversations.com/donate. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations on Facebook. Thanks very much for listening, and see you next week.